Believe it or not, in just 14 years, it will be the 100th anniversary of the release of the movie Gone with the Wind. We're getting close to the 100th anniversary of that film. And hopefully, many of us have seen it. We remember all the main characters, Scarlett O'Hara, Rhett Butler, Ashley, and Melanie. And of course, a number of colorful side characters, Mammy, Prissy, Dr. Meade, Aunt Pitty Pat Hamilton, and one particular favorite of mine, a character named Belle Watling, who is, to put it mildly, the local madam in the house of ill repute in Atlanta. Before the siege of Atlanta, a hospital had been set up, and Belle had made efforts to serve as a nurse for the wounded soldiers, and as she says, they didn't want her kind of nursing. She says, well, they were more than likely right. But she tried to offer money in support of the hospital in Atlanta, but had been turned down flat because no one of any real propriety would associate with her and her kind. But then she came to Melanie Hamilton, now Melanie Wilkes, to offer the money for the hospital. And Melanie treated her very, very differently. She saw past her reputation and her illicit profession and recognized a fellow Southerner who wanted to donate to the hospital to serve the soldiers. And she said to her, "You're so kind and you're so generous to offer this." To which Belle said, "No, I'm not. I'm just a Confederate like everyone else." Well, later on in the film, and a few years later from that action, Belle has an opportunity to protect Melanie's husband, Ashley, giving him an alibi when he was in danger of being arrested and possibly hanged following the war. And in gratitude, Melanie decides she's going to visit Belle at her home to thank her. And in one of my favorite scenes of the whole film, Belle, under cover of darkness, comes to Melanie's house saying, "Please don't come to my home. You have a reputation to protect. Come sit with me in the carriage and we'll sit and visit for a while." And all this goes back to that moment of kindness that Melanie showed to Belle. And one of my favorite lines, she says, "Miss Wilkes, if you ever see me on the street, you don't have to say hello to me or speak to me. I'll understand." And of course, Melanie responds, as only Melanie could, "I'll be proud to speak to you, to be under obligation for you, and I hope we meet again." A real human interaction where everyone else had treated Belle so badly, rightly or wrongly, but Melanie's kindness was never forgotten by Belle Watling, who in turn returned that act of kindness in saving Melanie's husband's life, the life of Ashley. I always think of that particular scene from Gone with the Wind in today's gospel, a very well-known gospel of the woman caught in adultery. Everyone else is citing the law, ready to stone her according to the law, and it ends with Jesus' words that he will not condemn them. This is the third of all three that we've heard of in close proximity these last couple of months of what I call the leave me alone and mind your own business passages, where in this case it's he who is without sin cast the first stone, so none of us are without sin, so none of us cast any stones at all ever. Often forgetting that Jesus himself doesn't cast a stone, Jesus himself does not condemn, but that also comes with the admonition, go and sin no more. And that is a call for all of us, not to be fixated on everyone else's sins, although at times we are called to correct one another, but that's another gospel passage for another Sunday. But we are called to be aware of our own sinfulness, be reluctant to condemn others, but also show that compassion to one another as human beings. And who knows, this may be that may be the act of kindness that moves people from their sinfulness to a better way of life. Why do we think that? Well, because this is one of a series of passages that really aren't connected strictly in the Scriptures, but our tradition has connected these different passages over our tradition and over our association with these stories. For example, this is an anonymous woman. By tradition, we would say this is Mary Magdalene, who is also featured in the Gospel of John, actually all four Gospels. But in the story, as we hear it in the Gospel, she is not identified. She's an anonymous woman caught in adultery. And it's somewhat similar to another anonymous woman, only in the Gospel of Luke, who is a sinful woman who throws herself at the feet of Jesus, weeps upon his feet, and dries it with her hair. We tend to associate these two women. And also that particular passage is associated with another passage in John in which Mary of Bethany, in gratitude for Jesus having raised her brother to life from the dead, her brother Lazarus, anoints Jesus' feet, dries it with her hair, not out of penance, but out of gratitude. So we go from an anonymous woman doing it out of penance to Mary of Bethany doing it out of gratitude. And this is the same Mary of Bethany who is the sister of Lazarus and the sister of Martha, as if Martha and Mary feign in a whole other passage that we find in another part of the Gospels. And then, of course, we have Mary of Bethany oftentimes being confused with Mary Magdalene, who is featured in all four Gospels. She's one who very distinctly is said to have had 7 demons expelled from her. And in all four Gospels, without exception, she is among the company of women who first bear witness to the empty tomb in the resurrection. And in at least 2 cases, she is the first person to whom Jesus, risen from the dead, appears and is celebrated as the first evangelist of the resurrection. But we've combined all of these stories into a tradition of Saint Mary Magdalene, of being a former woman of adulterous behavior, caught in adultery, a woman who received the mercy of Jesus, extended her gratitude by weeping on his feet and drying it with her hair, and being one of his most stalwart companions. Like I said, all these stories aren't necessarily connected in the Scriptures. Some of them are in different Gospels, but our tradition has associated them into an overarching tradition of Mary Magdalene. But who was Mary Magdalene? Well, even then, that depends on who you ask and when you ask them. Because even throughout history, we have a varying degree of tradition associated with Mary Magdalene. For example, in the Middle Ages, there was that telltale story of Mary Magdalene having been a spouse of Jesus. The Merovingian dynasty of France, prior to Charlemagne's reign, maintained their descendancy of Jesus and Mary Magdalene as part of the legitimization of their throne, of their reign on the throne of France. So when people were scandalized by the Da Vinci Code, I looked at it and said, you mean they never heard that before? But then you fast forward just in the 20th century. I always like to point out Cecil B. DeMille's King of Kings, I think it was. Mary Magdalene wasn't a woman of ill repute. She was a party girl. This was in the early 20s, on the heels of women's suffrage and women's lib. She was a party girl, a socialite. And there's that scene in the King of Kings, that silent movie, in which the 7 demons come out of her, being expelled by Jesus. They all speak as to which demons they are. And once those 7 demons are out of her, she takes her clothing, covers her up, including her shoulders and her head. She covers her up very, very modestly and doesn't say a word for the rest of the movie. And this on the heels of women's lib and women's suffrage. Fast forward to the 60s, you have the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, in which she is pretty much portrayed as like a 60s masseuse, and her song is, try not to get worried. Everything's all right now. Everything's fine. Close your eyes and surrender. Then, of course, fast forward to the era of the Da Vinci Code, and she becomes a symbol of suppressed feminism from all the way back to the Middle Ages. And this is before the woke movement in this country. So who is Mary Magdalene? Again, that depends on who you talk to and when you talk to them. She's almost like a catch-all character who culturally seems to be brought up and modified all throughout. But for our tradition as a Catholic people, she is the combination of all these various scriptural traditions of a previously sinful woman who in this gospel experiences the kindness of Christ, non-condemnation, who expresses a gratitude and sorrow and penance by washing Christ's feet with her tears and drying them with her hair, being one of his most stalwart, faithful companions, even to being one of the few people at the foot of the cross, along with the mother of Jesus and the beloved disciple, and being the first to witness the empty tomb and the first evangelist of the resurrection. When we combine all those traditions together, where does it begin? It begins with today's gospel, which Jesus does not treat her as an adulterous woman. He doesn't treat her as a point of law that must be fulfilled. He treats her as a human being, sinful like the rest of the people who were speaking to him. I always like to think that Jesus was little more than just doodling in the sand as they were speaking to him, not really listening to what they were saying. And when they insisted, oh, whoever's without sin, go for it, and continues doodling in the sand. And I've always been curious because how exactly did Jesus say it? Because sometimes things could be lost in translation. Because it makes a point to tell you in today's gospel that they all went away one by one, starting with the elders. I'm thinking, I wonder why they make that point, starting with the elders. So I looked up tried to look up the original language to see maybe Jesus just didn't say, "He who is without sin cast the first stone," but perhaps might have said, considering what she was accused of, "He who is without sin with her cast the first stone." Then it adds a little more weight to the fact that they all went one by one, starting with the elders, very quietly. Alas, I couldn't quite nail that one down. So it's perhaps "he who is without sin cast the first stone" is the legitimate translation of that particular passage. But the irony of all that, what the people were aiming for, what the leaders and scholars of the law were trying to do to trap Jesus in a point of law in which she is not really a human being, but an object of that point of law that must be fulfilled. And Jesus turns the tables on them until he is left alone with her to see her and treat her as a human being, one who is a sinner, one who is in need of the mercy of God, and who experienced it through her encounter with Christ. Until he asks her the most ironic of all questions, considering the circumstances. Where'd they all go? Is there no one who condemns you? Then nor do I condemn you. This isn't a passage in which we say, don't throw any stones because all of us are with sin. This isn't a passage in which Jesus ends it by saying, nor do I condemn you. But Christ gives us that catch in the midst of his compassion, of treating this woman like a human being. I do not condemn you. But with that lack of condemnation also comes an admonition. Go in peace. Let us hear that phrase from Christ to each one of us. Constantly throughout our lives as we seek to overcome sin, constantly whenever we come to the priest, through the church, in the sacrament of confession, we continue to hear those words. Jesus saying to each one of us, as he said to the woman caught in adultery, as he says to all sinners, nor do I condemn you. Go in peace. But from now on, go and sin no more.